Thank you very much, Carolyn. And thank you for inviting me here. I have two quick things to say. Time is short for this session, so two very quick things. First, my heartfelt thanks to my hosts, to Jonathan, to Gaël, to Anne France, and all of you for making me feel so welcome here. I have to say that it's wonderful to be back in Canada, and you've made me feel very much at home, so thank you. Second, I apologize that my French is rubbish, so enough to say about that, but I just can't speak to you in French, but my deepest apologies for that. As I was thinking about what to do in this short time that we have together, I thought, what's the most important thing that I've worked on, from my perspective, that has biggest ramifications, largest ramifications? And I thought, well, obviously the Roman governance of Judea and the Judean War are hugely important for Western civilization and for most every discipline in our related fields. They are kind of a fulcrum of some kind. For Jews, most obviously, all about the rise of the Pharisees, Sadducees, the rabbinic movement. For the Romans, who used the fall of Jerusalem, the Flavians, to end a vicious civil war that had been going on and was creating enormous chaos. By virtue of having claimed to defeat a foreign enemy, they were able to big this up into a massive new regime and a time of relative peace that lasted quite a long time. So for Roman history, very important. For Christian history, extremely important as well, both as background to the first two generations and then the Christian use of the fall of Jerusalem, of course. So all of this deserves some unpacking, but we have a very short time. So what can we do? Well, the established view of all of this is pretty simple. Namely, Imperial Rome and Jerusalem were at odds. They did not get along with each other. So the tensions began already when the Romans arrived with Pompey in 63 BCE, or possibly at least with Herod's death and that of the removal of his son, Archelaus. And then you had tensions between the population and the Romans, whether they were ruling directly or not, through their agents. And so people such as Judas the Galilean, the Zealots, the Sicarii are all famous names, false messiahs, and so on. The idea, the old idea, is that Rome bitterly oppressed the Judeans. They were hostile to monotheism and to such piety, and so they couldn't tolerate it. And this created repeated provocations. The pressure kept building until it exploded in 66 with the war against Rome. And the war was so hopeless as an undertaking, I mean, who's going to launch a war against Rome, that it must be explainable by some deep-seated hatred, because only that kind of built-up pressure could explain the popping of the cork that led to the war. And so even in a book from 2021, I won't name the author, my job here is not to get into polemics, but this very, very good author says it clearly took a massive effort for the Romans to defeat all of the Jewish rebels. The fighting lasted for 8 or 9 years, from 66 to 74 or 5, tens of thousands of Jewish, Roman, and other casualties. So the idea is, if you have such a massive, tough, long slog of a war fighting against the Romans, there must have been some very, very deep tensions underneath. In my analysis, this is a mirage. There was no such war. The war began, it wasn't 8 or 9 years, it began in 67 with the arrival of the Flavians. And then they basically had no fighting, really. Galilee welcomed them, more or less, only a problem at Yotapata in the north. And then Vespasian put his campaign on hold for nearly 2 years because of Nero's death and the year of the 4 emperors, the civil war in Rome. He had to suspend his campaign. He was doing no campaigning. So the only real war was the siege of Jerusalem, led by Titus, which lasted 5 or 6 months. And that is the war that the Flavians celebrated. And we can see that very clearly from the material remains. So there was no 8 or 9 years of tough slog. Judea was made a province. They celebrated their victory in a massive triumph in 71. It was all over and done from their point of view. Now, we don't have time to get into all of that, so these are the points I just made. So I'm going to focus on just one little trio of incidents that I think serves as a nice portal into what's going on at the time. And that is under Cumanus, who was the local governor of Judea, Ventidius Cumanus, in 48 to 52. These incidents took place in 51, 52. Josephus, so more than a decade before the war broke out. Josephus was about 14 at this time, 14, 15. Everything he writes before that time, he must have learned from traditions, from his family, from his parents or whatever, because it's well before his time of maturity. But these events, this trio of events, occurred just when he was sort of coming to an age where a young guy would be well aware of what was happening in the city. So he may well have directly experienced some of these, and that may be why he tells about them at such length after a notoriously slim narrative in his war. So to understand the first incident, we need to just bear in mind, most of you will know this already, but I refresh your memory, that there is an auxiliary cohort stationed in Jerusalem on rotation, only in Jerusalem apparently, in southern Syria, as far as we know. And they provide for the security of Jerusalem. Why is an interesting question, which we'll probe a little bit. But they also police the city, especially at festival times. So these chaps are walking around from their Fortress Antonia, which is the barracks adjoining the temple, and monitoring the crowds below in the temple courtyard. But they are foreigners. What kind of foreigners? We will explore in a moment. So here are the incidents, the trio of incidents I was talking about. There's a version in Josephus' War and a version in his Antiquities, and they are a little bit different in intriguing ways for reasons we discussed in the seminar on Friday. We don't have time to go back into all of that, but you will see the differences. If you were there on Friday, you'll see these as examples. So in the war, Josephus links all three right from the beginning. He says there was a trio of incidents that kind of built in tension, right? Whereas in Antiquities, he just starts with one, but then he shows the connections between them. A little bit difference there. The first story is that one of those chaps walking around the top of the colonnade just decided to lift his robe, assume the position, and make a very rude noise to the people below, mooning them with sound accompanying. And of course, they got very upset and grabbed whatever was near them. You can imagine thousands of people below. And this is Passover, this is a holy festival. So they start throwing stuff at this guy. And they appeal to Cumanus, this local regional governor, the prefect, the equestrian. They appeal to him for help. Now he, being the commander of this garrison, of course does what officers do in this situation. He sides with his soldiers, and he sends the entire garrison out to suppress the riots below. Josephus says there was a stampede for the exit, and 30,000 Judeans died. Friday we saw that that's divide by 100, it would still be a large number. Divide by 1,000 possibly. I mean, I saw in the news this morning that 56 people were killed in a stampede, and that made world news. So in Guinea. And that made world news. So 30,000 is quite extraordinary for Jerusalem, which probably couldn't accommodate more people than that. In the Antiquities version, the incident is mentioned alone, as I said, and he merely exposes himself without the sound effects. And now the idea is he's offended God. So that because of the different themes of the Antiquities, the people say, this is not an offense to us, it's an offense against God. But that's part of Antiquities' kind of thematic palette. And now he accuses Cumanus of having instigated the thing, whereas before they appealed to Cumanus as an honest broker. So who were these? And there's only 20,000. He just revises the number from 30 to 20,000. So this is his authorial freedom we discussed before. Second incident. Around the same time, unrelated in war, some bandits, some Judean bandits in the hill country rob an imperial agent who is named Stephanus. And the soldiers, in response, whoever these soldiers are, round up residents of surrounding villages. This is in full on your handout if you want to see the full story. This is just an abbreviation here. They round up ordinary villagers and bring them to Cumanus, right, the equestrian, for interrogation to see if they were involved in this assault. And meanwhile, a rogue soldier, whoever these soldiers are, finds a copy of the Torah and burns it. And the Judeans are outraged by this. They appeal to Cumanus, and notice what happens. Cumanus actually takes the responsible soldier, parades him before the Judeans, and has him executed. It's quite interesting, right? So he's now, in this situation, he's not just in the crisis backing up his soldiers, but he has the soldier executed for the sake of public calm, right? He knows that this will calm the people if he does that. Little bit different story in the Antiquities version. Here it's the refugees from the temple incident before that, in response and outrage, go into the hills as bandits and start assaulting. They look for somebody to rob. And the soldiers don't arrest everybody. Now it's only the village notables they bring in for questioning. And now there's no burning of the Torah. So again, little differences in the narrative details, but simply a soldier finds a Torah scroll and rips it up and jeers at it, makes fun of it. You know, imagine somebody grabbing a Quran in Afghanistan or Iraq and doing that kind of thing. Of course, now the Judeans say, again, in keeping with Antiquities themes, they would rather die than see their ancestral laws violated. And in this version, Cumanus beheads the soldier involved with an axe, right, with a double axe. And then the final incident. In war, a Judean from Galilee is heading to Passover, so the next Passover from the previous incident, so in spring of 52, it seems, is heading from Galilee to Jerusalem for Passover, and he's waylaid in what is now Jenin and murdered. The Judeans demand from Cumanus that he investigate this murder and punish the guilty. Cumanus says, I'm too busy. I've got other things to do. I'm in Caesarea doing my administrative work, don't have time. This creates an uproar in Jerusalem, and two men in particular, Eleazar and Alexander, lead a spontaneous charge against the nearest Samarian villages. So they're not going up to Jenin, which is in the northwest part of Samaria. They're just attacking the nearest Samarian villages as a retaliation, right, against Samaritans. So Akrabatene, which is that's the frontier with between Judea and Samaria, they attack the near enemy there. Cumanus now wakes up and says, okay, there's too much violence going on, and he takes what is called the Sebastine cavalry wing against them. Now, the Samarians, notice the connection here, the Samarians complain to one Quadratus, Ummidius Quadratus, who is the legate in Syria, the senatorial legate. They complain to him, who's in Tyre, which has been in the news very much recently, about the ruin of their land. The Judeans blame the Samarians and Cumanus for the murder in the first place, and then for not investigating it, as you would expect. So you have two sides going at each other. The Judeans bitter about the original murder, and the Samarians bitter because the Judeans have been ransacking villages all around the place that had nothing to do with the murder that was in Jenin. So Quadratus comes to check the whole thing out, and notice he has no trouble coming into this area. It's part of his province. Comes to Caesarea and immediately kills the Judean detainees. So the ones who have been attacking the Samarian villages, he has them killed. Then he moves on to Lydda, or Lod, where the airport is now, and kills 18 Judeans involved in the fighting who've been identified. Now he says, right, I've had enough of all this, you all go to Rome. You send, you can take a delegation, each Judeans and Samaritans, you go to Rome and explain to Claudius what's been going on here. So they go to Rome, and in this story, Agrippa II, so the great-grandson of King Herod, who grew up in Rome, right, is hanging around in Rome. The Herodians like to hang out in Rome, and so he's there, and he's advising Claudius, and he's a friend, he's grown up in Claudius's family court. So he's advising Claudius, and Claudius immediately turns against the Samaritans, executes three of them, has three of them executed on the spot, banishes his own prefect, Cumanus, to the west of the empire, and the tribune, whose name appears here for the first time, of the cohort who was responsible, is sent back to Jerusalem for torture and execution. This is amazing, right? Here's a Roman emperor sending back his own military people, well, banning one and then having others executed. Now, in the Antiquities version, again, some small details, different. Many Passover pilgrims are now murdered, not just one, traveling from Galilee, so Josephus is amplifying the story. Similar kind of basic plot. Now it's the Galileans who persuade the Jerusalems to fight on their behalf, persuade the Jerusalemites to take up their cause and say, look, we're not getting justice, so will you help us? And they raid the Samarian villages, led by Eleazar alone. Alexander has dropped out of the picture somehow. Cumanus now takes both the cavalry wing, the rapid reaction force who could ride over into the hills, and 4 infantry cohorts. So that's his whole army, because one cohort is based in Jerusalem already on rotation. So this is his entire military force. And Josephus says, you can see it in your handout, he arms the Samaritans as well. So the Samaritans who have been defending themselves against the Judean raids, he actually somehow arms them or allows them to be armed. They accuse the Judeans of disrespecting Rome. That's now their accusation. Not for themselves, we're getting attacked, but you are breaking the covenant we have that you look to Rome for our security, not resort to vigilantism and start taking it into your own hands. You're disrespecting Rome. And this convinces Cumanus. So now the Judeans complain. They claim that Cumanus has been bribed. It wasn't just that he was too busy, but he's been bribed to look the other way in this account. Quadratus now goes to Samaria in this version and finds the Samaritans guilty. So it's quite a difference from the other version in war. He goes to Samaria first, not Caesarea, and finds Samaritans guilty. He realizes they're the ones who started all of this. And so he crucifies both some Judeans and some Samaritans. And then also moving on to Lydda, he kills 5 Judeans who are accused of insurrection there. Now, in this version, what happens in Rome is that Agrippa works through Agrippina, Claudius's wife, right, to effect his aims. She wasn't mentioned before. Now, Agrippina was famous in Rome for, twisting Claudius around her little finger. So it could well be it's just an added sort of novelistic detail because Josephus likes to refer to imperial women who had extraordinary influence with their males. Okay, so what's going on behind the scenes in all this? Clearly, these are 2 different accounts with significant differences in the stories, but I think we can understand, again, if you were in the seminar on Friday, I think we can understand how Josephus adapted his material freely to his themes. He wasn't that concerned about 20,000, 30,000, big number, lots of people killed, who was killed here or there. But the basic storyline, the underlying story, is very similar. So in both cases. So we want to try to figure out, get a little more clear, who was who. So who was this Quadratus and who was Cumanus, who were the Samaritans, and who were the auxiliary soldiers? Well, I'm going to run through this very quickly in the interest of time. So I have a few kind of sequential maps, and this is all familiar to you. So I'm going to go through it very quickly just by way of refreshing memories to clarify where I'm coming from, as they say. So you all know that Jerusalem was taken from the Canaanites 1000 BC. The northern kingdom, Israel, was destroyed, at least according to the biblical account, in the 8th century by the Neo-Assyrians. Jerusalem then destroyed by the Neo-Babylonians, 586. The Persians, allowed Jerusalem to be rebuilt, encouraged its rebuilding. According to the Bible, the Samaritans already resisted that, didn't want it to happen, and Josephus plays this up quite a bit. Jerusalem remained a very small temple state. Hillel Geva, an Israeli scholar, estimates a very small population in the low hundreds through this period. Judea, was the hinterland of Jerusalem. Simply, it was the agricultural chora or territorium of this temple polis, basically. So Jerusalem is basically a temple polis. That's all there is to it, a temple and the supporting infrastructure. And until the 160s, Samaria was the top dog. Samaria was the military administrative capital of the entire region through these centuries. Under the Persians, under the Ptolemies, under the Seleucids, Samaria was the city of Samaria was the capital, right? And archaeology shows that in the early 2nd century, under the Seleucids, it was a really flourishing place. There's lots of archaeological stuff found, all kinds of votive offerings of foreigners and tons of sacrifices. It was a really thriving place. And so Samaria remains paramount until the Maccabean revolt. Judea is small and therefore vulnerable, and that leads to the Hasmonean revolt, when whatever happened with Antiochus IV, scholars debate it. But anyway, at some point he tried to rub out Judean traditions of some kind, and the Hasmonean family led a revolt. They then exploited the weakness of the Seleucid rulers to make new alliances with competing Seleucid rulers, and launched a campaign of expansion over the next 2 generations, first under Jonathan. So these maps indicate the growth of Judea through this period. John Hyrcanus was a major figure here because he conquered both to the north Samaria and to the south Idumea. A text quickly to look at here, he himself, Hyrcanus, conquered Shechem and Mount Gerizim, right, where the Samaritan temple was. In addition, and he destroyed them. In addition, Antiquities elaborates on this, but I'm giving you War's shorter version. In addition, he subdued what are called the Kuthian, that is, the Samaritan people, who lived around that temple on Gerizim that resembled the one in Jerusalem. He also advanced as far as the city of Samaria, which is only about 11, 12 kilometers away from Gerizim. And he blocked it off in his siege, left it to his sons, and they forced the siege that involved cannibalism and all the rest, and they eventually enslaved the population and destroyed the city of Samaria. Then came Alexander Jannaeus, but when the Romans arrived in 63 BC, they first stripped Judea of all of its acquisitions. And Josephus makes this very clear. He kind of laments it. He says, after depriving the ethnos of the polis in Coelis, Syria, it had conquered, he placed them under a Roman commander, Scaurus, appointed for the purpose, and confined the ethnos entirely within its proper borders. He also rebuilt Gadara and other places which had been destroyed by the Judeans, the Hasmoneans. Thus, he liberated the polis in the interior from them. And he lists a whole bunch of them, including Samaria. Right, so these were all now, after the Hasmoneans, rebuilt at first by the Romans and joined to the province of Syria. However, of course, we see clearly that many of Judea's neighbors harbored long-lasting resentments because of this, having been subject to Jerusalem, having been driven out, their cities destroyed in some cases. And we have plenty of other evidence, also from other authors, and material evidence in some cases of the ongoing conflicts, local, regional conflicts. However, when the next governor arrives, Gabinius, He recognizes that the Judeans have settled in large numbers under the Hasmoneans, and he makes 5 centers, toparchies, of Judean control, including in Galilee. But then, under the next generation of Romans, they put the whole thing back under Jerusalem's hegemony once again in the person of King Herod, and they give him the rule over the whole lot. Why? Well, I would suggest, moving very quickly now, the Romans didn't actually have a plan, they didn't have a policy, but they had certain instincts. One was economy, save money, get the biggest bang for the buck. So let as many other people do the hard work as possible and get as much revenue as you can. The legionary force is too small to occupy the empire anyway, so it's used in clusters in various places, not for perimeter defense as it would later be used. It's more there as a deterrent and to intimidate. But what you then do is cultivate local elites in the cities, maximize local autonomy, and then hold them responsible for peace, and offer Roman citizenship to the leading elites so they have a buy-in in the Roman project. Then rule by division, that is to say, not as a deliberate policy, but allow the natural rivalries and competitions to bubble, and then that's a kind of security for the empire, that they are not going to gang up on you. Make sure that they are all linked to you directly, to Rome directly for their favors, so they're competing with each other, and this creates a healthy atmosphere, but prevent them from killing each other. If that's no good, they can't be undertaking vigilante activity. Also, the emperor wants to prevent any governor from acquiring too much power because he might become a threat. So if there's a way to moderate his power, like the governor of Syria, which is a major province, by having an allied king in part of it, that kind of takes the edge off his potential power base. And then most efficient way to govern is to use trusted friends as these allied kings. It's a fiction of alliance, of course. It's a client kingship, but they called it alliance and friendship. So like this, not everybody around Rome getting together, but rather everybody dependent on Rome. And rivalry is good, if not actual hatred. So when Herod died, there's an issue. What do we do now? Well, Augustus dismissed the request of the local aristocracy of Jerusalem to be joined to Syria. Right? He dismissed that and said, no, I want to honor my old friend and I want to keep this train going as long as possible. So I'm going to appoint his young sons, who are in their 20s, to parts of his kingdom. So those are the 3 sons, my 3 sons, who were the surviving sons. Herod had killed several of his other sons, but these are the survivors. And he says, okay, we'll see how they do. Now, 2 of them succeeded brilliantly and governed for decades, longer even than Herod had. But Archelaus managed to offend both of the Samaritan elites and the Judean elites, and he was removed. So now Augustus accepts the earlier plea and joins Judea to Syria. So how to manage the southern part? Well, plan A was you've got this senatorial legate in the north with 4 legions, but he keeps them in the north because the biggest threat is Parthia over the Euphrates. So in the south, you want an allied king. That's the preferred plan, governing from Jerusalem. But if that's not possible, what does he do? He doesn't appoint a monarch from some other people, from some other ethnos or other polis, right? He doesn't elevate any of them. He says, okay, if we can't have a Herodian, whom we trust, they grow up in Rome, we know who they are. If we can't have them, well, I'm going to send an equestrian governor. And he's going to have, as his base in Caesarea, at his base, he's going to have an auxiliary force. So the big question is, in the time that remains, this is what I want to focus on. Who constitutes this auxiliary army? Herod's army was large and multi-ethnic, his allied army, possibly 18,000 or so, that's been estimated, we don't really know, because it included many ingredients. He was conciliatory towards Samaria himself. He rebuilt the city of Samaria as Sebaste, or emperor city. He installed the imperial cult there. He was one of the first, probably the first, in 27 BCE to install imperial cult, an imperial temple already. He settled veterans there. He married a Samarian woman eventually, and even before that he married in Samaria an earlier wife, one of his 10 wives. So he's very warm towards Samaria and trying to include them in his project, just as he shows largesse toward the coastal cities, the Decapolis cities. He's trying to make them all happy under his reign. They're not happy. Anyway, it doesn't matter that much, but he wants to make them happy. So his army has Judeans, right, maybe 10,000, Samarians, a few thousand, Idumeans, Trachonitans, Iturians, Arabs, Germans, and then a bodyguard. The bodyguard is Germans and Gauls and Thracians, right? So he's got pretty sizable army, and it seems that he kept them in their ethnic units separately, right, under often Roman officers who are seconded to help out and train them in Roman ways of doing things, using not legionary weaponry, but something that works, that's familiar. On his death, what happened to the army? Well, probably Philip received the Trachonitans, because they're in his part of the kingdom, and Antipas, the Iturians, and some Judeans in the north. The bodyguard either stayed with Archelaus until he was booted in 6 CE, or they left. We're not sure. We don't know. So his army would have Judean, Samarian, Idumean components, it looks like. When he was booted out, however, what happened then? Well, it seems that the Judeans left the armed force and the Idumeans left. Right? They didn't want to serve under Romans in Caesarea. Caesarea is a Greco-Roman city, and they didn't want to go there as a base for whatever reason. We don't know for sure why. We don't have all the details. So the power center moved to the coast, Caesarea. So the auxiliary then, what was the old allied force, now a shrunken auxiliary force, is basically Samarian. And they are now called by Josephus Sebastine. They are recruited mainly from around the area of the Samarian capital, Sebaste. And Josephus repeatedly calls them Sebastine forces. That is, 5 infantry, he refers to this quite specifically a few times, 5 infantry cohorts, probably 500 in most cases, perhaps 1,000 in one case, and a cavalry wing of 480, 500. So 3,000, maybe 3,500, but 3,000 is the figure he gives a couple of times. And it's one of his more plausible figures for the size of the auxiliary. So Caesarea, thanks to Todd Boland for this aerial photograph, you can see there was a temple to Augustus in Roma. By the coast, there were all kinds of entertainment facilities, like this hippodrome. It was a Greco-Roman city, not a Judean city, right, with statues everywhere and an imperial cult as well. Aqueduct partly from the 1st century, a wealthy person's home from the 1st century, pretty spiffy, I would say. And this is part of the governor's palace with a big pool right on the coast that's been excavated. So, who were Quadratus and Cumanus? Well, Caius Humidus Durmius Quadratus is known from a few other indications from a very famous Roman family. He was born in 12 BCE, was suffect consul already in about 40, it seems, it's not certain. He had been proconsul in various places and an imperial legate, and now Claudius had sent him in 50 CE. He was already in his 60s when Claudius sent him. Nero kept him on, as Nero did keep on some older senators, and he died in Syria, aged over 70. It seems, in the late 50s. There's a bit of archaeology from his time there as governor. Ventidius Cumanus is known only from Josephus and Tacitus, a line in Tacitus. But he was a much more minor figure. He's an equestrian who was sent out to Caesarea, right? So, as the prefect over the auxiliary and under the authority of the senator Quadratus in this massive province of Syria. Tacitus has a strange account about Cumanus, which I won't get into because we don't have time. But if you want to talk about it later, we can. So for Rome, the auxiliary is a wild card. Why? Well, because they know, it's perfectly obvious that the Samaritans have a strong antipathy toward Jerusalem. That just goes with the territory. They are the local enemies. But their animosity can be checked by the prefect, by the legate, by the Herodian royals who are collaborating with all of them, and if necessary, by the emperor. So we see this in the episodes we were looking at, right? We see how that operates. And it seems that they thought it worth the risk because the Samaritans had such a long martial tradition and they were willing to do this stuff anyway. The Judeans had backed out, the Idumeans had backed out. And so if they're ready and willing and they're a ready-made force, why not? But it creates problems in certain situations. There is a tension there. And the episode I want to draw to your attention occurs 7 years or so before the one we're looking at. Okay, I'm going to be very quick. I'm almost at the end. This episode, I'm not going to read it because there's no time. This episode is as follows. King Agrippa I dies, and he has recalled the Allied army, right? So King Agrippa rules from 41 to 44 CE from Jerusalem, and he has reconstituted an Allied army as an Allied king. But he dies inconveniently young, inconsiderately young. He just up and dies one day. And what happens is the power base moves back to Caesarea. And Josephus, at the end of book 19 of the Antiquities, tells this story in detail. You have it there, I think. Oh, maybe you don't. But it's like this. The Caesareans and the Samaritans celebrate in outrageous ways, right? They hold street parties. They go crazy celebrating the king's death. And remember, the king was a very close friend of Claudius. This king, Agrippa, had in fact helped, according to not only Josephus but also other sources, had helped Claudius ascend the throne. So they're very tight, and Claudius had given him his kingship. So Claudius is outraged that his friend has been treated this way, the memory of his friend. So he wants to send his son, the second, Agrippa II, who's only 16. He wants to send him as king. That's his first plan. He says, I'll show him. We're going to put another king in place there. But his advisors say, it's too young. Don't send him. So he sends out another prefect. But this time, with Cuspius Fadus, he tells them to read the riot act to the auxiliary force, right? And what Josephus says about them is really interesting here because he says that they were, they took strength because many of them were in military service, right? So there are lots of people in the area and their relatives are serving in the army, and that's why they're so excited about being liberated from this Judean king's rule. Josephus says at the end of the passage, but these very men prove, because Claudius doesn't remove them in the end. He threatens to send them away to the Black Sea, but he's dissuaded from doing it. But these very men prove to be a source of the greatest disasters for the Judeans in the coming times, having sown the seeds of the war. I think this is an extremely important passage, which is often neglected, because what it's saying is the auxiliary were the ones who were ginning up the problems, inter-ethnic problems with the Judeans, right? That's how the war started. It wasn't anti-Roman stuff, it was anti-local enemy stuff. But because they are part of the Roman system, they are part of the Roman army, right? If you react against them, then the bigger guys are going to come in. The legions are going to come in, and the senatorial legate is going to come in. He has to because he has to keep the peace. And that's how it all begins to unravel, it seems to me. So, like this, in conclusion, it seems to me that the local issues, the local conflicts were paramount, but they were normally kept in check. as we see in the Cumanus episodes, right? These 3 episodes, you can see the levels at which they are kept in check. They go up the ladder until they reach the emperor. And so the Judeans are uniquely protected in this system, actually. The Sumerians are the predictable issue. So my conclusions, there's no one Roman policy toward the Jews, no such thing, but there's a set of conditions on the ground, and the Roman reactions vary according to who's doing what, who the personalities are, and how effective they are. All the way up until the time of Nero, I would say, it works well. The problem is that when Nero comes into power, in his later years, he sends a prefect, Gessius Florus, and tells him to collect a lot of revenue from the temple because he wants revenue, and to use the Sumerian auxiliary as his muscle. And so they go in and start beating heads and so on, and the people react. Now the problem is the elders of the city say, no, 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 you're going to bring in a Roman retaliation because of this, and you don't want to do that. But of course, people are so upset and they see no remedy, so some people arm themselves and fight with the auxiliary whom they see as their enemy, and sure enough, the Romans come in. So this is basically what I had to say. I think this image of the Judeans, as under Roman occupation, is completely misleading and mistaken, and of this sort of innate conflict between Judeans and Romans doesn't make any sense at all of the evidence. Actually, Judea flourished under Roman rule. If anyone had a grievance, it was people like the coastal cities and the Sumerians and others who saw Judea flourishing and protected under Roman rule. And that's where the seeds of conflict began. The Judeans looked to Rome for resolution. They did not find it under Nero, who was executing his senators, people like Cestius Gallus, his senator in Syria, aged over 70. He was having them executed or killing themselves at this time. So the wheels came off, is what I'm trying to suggest. But this was not the normal way of Roman governance in Judea. I went over time. Sorry about that. Thank you.